Good morning, everyone. This is Connie Chan Robinson with the Center for Collaborative Planning, the Public Health Institute, and a warm welcome to all of you for joining us this morning for the second of two webinars. This one focused on trauma and its impact on children's health and learning. Our center has been very pleased to have been able to partner with our collaborators at the California Department of Public Health and the California Home Visiting Program to sponsor these series of webinars. I wanted to also call out and extend our appreciation to the Heising-Simons Foundation for their funding support of these series of webinars. A couple of housekeeping events and slides. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties during this WebEx session, please dial the number that's on this title slide, 1-866-229-3239 for assistance. And if you want to take a moment to write that number down for future reference, that might be helpful if you do run into any problems. The audio portion of the web forum can be heard through your computer speakers or a headset plugged into your computer. If at any time you're having technical difficulties regarding audio, please send a question in the Q&A panel and someone will provide the teleconference information to you. We'll be reviewing the instructions for the Q&A panel in just one moment. So we did want to let folks know that we are recording this webinar, which will be made available after this morning for your viewing pleasure and audio pleasure. You can submit questions using the Q&A feature. At the end of the webinar, we invite you to complete a brief survey that will pop up in a new window after the web forum ends. And the recording, as well as any additional resources, will be available through a link that we will send to all of the registrants and participants after the web forum this morning. So here's just a little bit about the Q&A feature. We will have time at the end of Dr. Perry's presentation this morning to entertain some questions and his response. Please submit questions via the Q&A feature. You should see a box at the top of your screen that's Q&A. Send your questions. Make sure you send your questions to all panelists and type your questions in the box that's provided. Our agenda for today, we are currently doing our welcome and just a brief overview of the agenda. We're currently going through our webinar housekeeping. I would then introduce Gina Gordon, with the Health Program Specialist at CHVP, to introduce Dr. Perry. After his presentation, we will entertain Q&A and then wrap up and close. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce to you all Gina Gordon, who is the Health Program Specialist at the California Home Visiting Program, who will introduce Dr. Perry.
Thank you, Connie, and good morning, everyone. My name is Gina Gordon, and on behalf of everyone at the California Home Visiting Program, welcome. And we hope that you are as excited as we are to have Dr. Bruce Perry with us today. Dr. Perry is the Senior Fellow at the Child Trauma Academy in Houston, Texas, an adjunct professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the Feinberg School of Medicine at Northwestern University in Chicago. Dr. Perry's work has been instrumental in describing how childhood experiences, including neglect and traumatic stress, change the biology of the brain and thereby the health and development of the child. So we're really excited to have him here with us today, and now I'll go ahead and hand it over to Dr. Perry.
Thank you for unmuting me. I hope I'm unmuted. First of all, thank you for asking me to come and give this presentation. I am going to talk about the relationship between early childhood interactions and the development of systems in the brain and body involved in physical health, learning, emotional health, regulation, all kinds of things that are of concern to us as we are thinking about what makes a healthy child and a healthy youth and a healthy adult. So part of what I would like to do is teach you a little bit of neurobiology, not too much, but talk about that neurobiology in a context that will helpfully make everyone understand why the home visitation practices are so powerful and why they're so important. And in the end, what I really am trying to say is that the relationship that is created through a home visiting intervention has the biological power to influence in positive ways everybody in that household, the parent, the infant, the other siblings, and I want you to understand a little bit about the biology of that, so that some of the other things that you have been reading and some of the other things that you know about the relationship between early life adversity and outcomes, for example, makes sense. So let me just start by using this diagram of the brain. And those of you who know anything about my work or who've heard me talk or read anything know that I have this kind of bias about the brain. I try to teach people a little bit about looking at these complex issues through the lens of neurobiology. And it's not the only way to conceptualize problems, but we find it a very helpful way to understand some of the things that you see in your work. And again, I want you to appreciate that what I'm about to talk about is a simplification of extremely complex phenomenon. But I think these core concepts that we illustrate with these slides, and as I move through the presentation, these core concepts can be tremendously useful in helping you understand your work and the people you work with. So let's start with this. The brain is extremely complex. There are multiple neural networks within the brain. These neural networks are distributed throughout different brain regions, and collectively, the 86 billion neurons and the 10 times as many glial cells and the 2,000 times as many synaptic connections all work together to somehow create the miracle of a healthy, productive, functioning human being. And one of the things that we tend to do that's probably not accurate is when we teach and talk and think about the brain, we think about it as somehow separate from the body. But in fact, the brain is just part of the body. And there are multiple ways in which the brain and body are interconnected, both directly and indirectly. One of the most direct ways is through the direct output from the brain into the body through the autonomic nervous system. So we literally have nerves that go from the lower parts of our brain out into our heart, our lung, our gut, our skin, and they influence and regulate all these peripheral parts of our body. We also have some indirect routes out into the body through the release of hormones and regulation of hormones, and we call this the neuroendocrine system. And a lot of you have heard of cortisol and growth hormone, and these are things that are influenced, and the release of these substances is controlled by output from the brain. And then the third thing that happens is that the brain actually influences your immune system. And so your brain and body are continually communicating with each other, interacting with each other, and influencing each other in ways that are very important. Now, the reason I am talking about that is that a lot of you have heard about and are very well aware of the ACE studies, ACE studies. And obviously in California, you all know that these original epidemiological studies were conducted in California. You probably, I would bet everybody who's listening has either heard of or directly heard Vince Felitti talk about this. And these are very, very interesting and very important studies that documented and continue to document in the new versions of these studies that if you have developmental chaos, developmental threat, developmental loss, developmental trauma of different types, you end up having higher risk as you get older for heart disease, for lung disease like asthma, for diabetes, for a variety of other physical health problems. And the reason is these systems that go out and influence and regulate the body are altered because major neural networks in the lower parts of the brain that are responsible for regulating those systems themselves have become abnormally regulated. These stress response systems are able to be modified by experience. And one of the things that you're going to see is that the majority of the families that you work with have had, both for the children and for the parents of those children, a history of adversity. The vast majority of families that we are serving in these, again, in these systems have had challenges with poverty, challenges with, sometimes it's a domestic violence issue, sometimes it's substance abuse, sometimes they themselves were victims of abuse, and as they grow up, they end up becoming parents. And so there's this transgenerational component to what we're going to talk about, and the key neurobiological mediator of many of the trauma-related changes that take place in the brain and body are these systems that originate low in the brain. And let me take a minute and talk about this so that this kind of makes some sense to you. So this is essentially a different version of the same image. Part of what this is trying to show you is that the various brain-mediated functions are mediated by different areas in the brain. So the lower parts of the brain regulate simpler regulatory functions. And as you get higher in the brain, you get into more complex organization and more complex functions. So ultimately, the top parts of your brain, the parts that, we would refer to as the cortical parts, mediate the most human and most complex functions, such as abstract cognition, future planning, language, all of that kind of stuff. And so because this presentation is going to be a little bit about learning, and it's going to be a little bit about health, part of what I'm going to talk about is how health, risk for health problems, and risk for learning problems are related. And in many ways, the cause of health problems following developmental adversity and learning problems following developmental adversity are caused by the same physiological problem. And if you understand that, many things start to become clear about, number one, understanding the etiology of the problems, but really more important, understanding how to address and heal these problems. And then number three, By the end of this 90-minute presentation, hopefully you'll understand why you, as a home visitor, or you as somebody who administers a home visiting program, have the capability to literally change the body and the brain of the individuals you work with. And this is all related to these systems right here. So let me talk about this for a second. I did mention that we have 86 billion neurons, but somehow all of these neurons are able to become interconnected and work together in relatively seamless ways. And it's pretty miraculous that the complexity of the human brain can be, if you will, harnessed to create smooth motor functionings, the ability to actually make sounds that we turn into words, the capacity to think about things, the capacity to feel and love. All of these are brain-mediated capabilities. And I think that if you understand a little bit about these systems, you'll come to some appreciation of why stress and certain patterns of stress lead to problems. So let me just talk about these neural networks. You've probably heard of dopamine. You've probably heard of norepinephrine. You've probably heard of serotonin. And there are some other neurotransmitters, but networks that are equally important, but these are some of the most important. And you have heard of them because they actually influence many, many, many functions. I'm having a little trouble here with my cursor, sorry. One of the functions that they mediate, or one of the roles of these neural networks, is to basically orchestrate and integrate function across multiple areas of the brain. And this is something that they're able to do because they send signals to multiple parts of the brain simultaneously, and, as I talked about earlier, out to the body. So because these neural networks have this interesting distribution, they're able to communicate and influence functioning in every part of the brain and the body. And because of two things. One, the fact that they have this widespread architecture, they go everywhere in the body and brain, and because they're low in the brain, right next to, and get direct input from the inside world and from the outside world, these neural networks are ideal for modulating stress. And so they become the major components of the stress response system. And the reason I'm talking about this and kind of going into this in great depth is that if you understand that these systems can be changed by trauma, and you understand that these systems can be changed by relational interactions, you start to get some understanding of vulnerability and the capacity to heal. And so there's resilience and there's risk, and we're going to talk about those. But again, let me just make sure that this is really clear. These neural networks that originate low in the brain, they communicate to all these other parts of the brain, and all of the sensory input from the outside world comes in low in the brain. In the first place in the brain that your touch, smell, sound, and the first place in your brain that hunger or thirst come in and say to your brain, I need some help, is the low parts of the brain. Two things about that. One is that that's actually kind of good. You know, I mean, your brain has the ability to very quickly process and act on information that comes from the inside and the outside of the world so that you can act on it very quickly. So, for example, when you get a signal that you're a little bit low in oxygen, you'll send a there are neural networks that will send a signal in here, and it will say, hey, you need to take a breath. And so you'll literally take a breath. And many of you know that even if somebody has huge parts of their brain that are damaged from, let's say you have a car accident and you get huge parts of your brain that are damaged, that this simple respiratory function still works. You still breathe in and you breathe out, breathe in and breathe out, breathe in and breathe out. This is automatic. It's happening out of your consciousness, and it is the brain responding to incoming input. It sees a little need. I'm out of sync. I'm out of balance. I need to take a deep breath, get more oxygen, and then I need to exhale and get rid of that carbon dioxide. And your brain does that with lots of stuff. We have these, if you will, precortical automatic processing that takes place all the time. Now, one of the things that happens if you have developmental trauma is that if you are let's say you're a young child and you grow up in an environment and mom has a boyfriend who comes in and starts to beat her up, and he just happens to like wear Old Spice aftershave and listens to country western music, your brain will make an association. It will literally connect the sound of country western music with activation of the threat response. And so what happens is when you make that association between a significant threat and the sound of country music, your brain, the next time you are out, let's say you're 20 years old now, and you'll hear country western music, and it'll come in, it'll get processed, and you'll activate a threat response even before the information is able to process and get up to the smart part of your brain. So this is a significant challenge for those of us who do work with kids who are in high-risk environments. If you have, over the course of your development, created a number of associations about things that were present when you were afraid or hungry or thirsty or alone, your brain will later on in life, it will react to those similar cues in a way that essentially makes the past present. Part of that is because these lower parts of the brain don't tell time. So let me give you an example that might occur when you are a home visitor. Let's say that the mother herself was raised in an environment where she always was made to feel stupid by her teachers, that the teachers didn't understand that she came from a background where she was always threatened, and so her ability to learn was impaired. And it's not that she was dumb, it's just hard to learn when you're under threat, and I'll talk about that in greater detail in a minute. But because of that, she had interaction after interaction after interaction with people who were adult authority figures who were theoretically trying to help her. Teacher, counselor, and then maybe a social worker. But all of her interactions with people who were from government prior to this were that you're not smart, you're not capable, you're not competent, and you come and knock on the door and you're trying to be helpful and friendly and supportive, and the default response that she has is that you're just like all the rest, and she will categorize you as somebody who's going to judge her, somebody who's going to be critical of her. And because of that, she will feel distressed, and her ability to hear what you have to say will be impaired. And we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail in a second. But I want you to appreciate this precortical processing. I want you to think and remember that the brain is organized in a way that as information from the outside world comes in, the way the brain processes is essentially from bottom to top. this slide, if I show you nothing else, if you remember nothing else from this whole talk, this is probably the most important slide. Basically what this is saying is that if you understand the architecture of the brain, it is absolutely inevitable that in order for information to get up to the smart part of your brain, where you can reason with somebody or teach them a new cognitive concept, you have to go through the middle part of the brain. And that middle part of the brain is the relational part of the brain. In other words, the best way to actually make somebody learn something or change their cortex is if you have a relational interaction. And this is, again, this is one of the tremendous powers of home visiting models. You're not just throwing a videotape at somebody and say, learn this content. You are a human being. You are relationally mediating content. This is so powerful and so important, and I may be able to talk about how powerful in a minute, but the bottom line is, and I'm making an estimate, the transmission of cognitive content in context of a relationship is at least 10 times stronger than the transfer of information in a non-relational way. And it's probably even 100 times stronger, but 10 times would be conservative. So that's one of the powers of a home visiting model, is that you are forming a relationship to convey content. But let me back up a little bit further in the brain. You cannot make a meaningful and effective relationship with somebody unless they are regulated. And this is, everybody who's done home visiting knows this. Everybody who's done law enforcement knows this. Everybody who's been in a relationship knows this, that when somebody's upset, anxious, afraid, the ability to reasonably connect with them is impaired, and the ability to reason with them and use words is absolutely impossible. So one of the most challenging aspects of the work of home visiting is being able to, number one, stay quiet enough so that you are regulated, and I'll talk about why that's important in a minute, and ultimately have adequate interactions and positive interactions and do certain activities that are going to regulate the people you are trying to influence. I'm going to talk, the entire rest of this presentation is going to be about these two, relate to one aspect of either regulation or forming relational connections in order that you can actually reason with somebody. So let me go back and let me find the slides to talk about this in the right way. So here we go. All right. So now I've been talking about those neural networks that originate low in the brain, that they're involved in the stress response. And most of you know about post-traumatic stress disorder. Most of you know that the mechanisms by which adversity leads to long-term cognitive and physical health problems is because the stress response systems have been changed. In other words, they have been unpredictably and severely activated for prolonged periods of time, and it leads to vulnerability. It leads to risk, and it leads to risk in every part of the brain that those neural networks innervate. So, going back to, these slides, what that means is every single part of the brain that gets input from these neural networks, and every single part of the body that gets input from those systems will be vulnerable when these systems are altered by chaos, threat, developmental trauma, adversity, and so forth. That means that children and adults who've had those patterns of adversity are going to have physical health problems, they're going to have attention problems, they're going to have self-regulation problems, relational problems, cognitive problems, speech and language problems, fine motor control problems. They've got problems in every single physiological system you look at. If you looked at their glycogen release in their body, it would be different. If you looked at insulin release, it's impacted. If you look at white blood cell migration, it's abnormal. If you look at turning on and off histones in the chromosomes, it's abnormal. It's because these neural networks have this incredibly ubiquitous distribution in all other parts of the brain. And when they become abnormally regulated and when they become sensitized, you end up having risk. So let's talk about this for a second. I'm going to talk about the mechanism by which those systems become abnormally organized. And so again, here's a little science. Don't be afraid. What I have here is, as you all know, everybody has sort of a set point that let's pretend that this is sort of the baseline level of regulation of an individual's stress response system. And let's say that they have a moderate stressor, and that stressor will activate their stress response systems. There'll be a peak level of activation, and then they'll start to come back down towards baseline. And now we all know that we've had stressful things. Everybody's had stressful things. It could be something like giving a presentation. It could be something like the annual review. It could be something like visiting a new home. It could be something like in a home visit, somebody yells at you. That's stressful. But most of us are able to get back down to our baseline before there's another stressful experience. So, but what can happen is if you have one stress, and then before you get back to baseline, there's another stressor that's pretty significant, and then another, and then there's an extreme stressor, you end up having a sensitization of your stress response systems. In other words, your baseline level of arousal changes, your baseline gets higher. And so at baseline, your brain regulates kind of like it does if you were under threat. And then you have a much more, the second part of this is that you have a more extreme response to the same level of stressor. So if you have a moderate stress, later on a moderate challenge, you'll have an extreme response. And so again, most of you recognize that this is kind of what happens with individuals who have had lots of developmental chaos, developmental threat, and they end up with an overactive and overly reactive stress response system. And so this is a different way of showing that. So let me just walk through this for a second. Most of us are lucky enough to have what we would call a neurotypical or normal state reactivity. So you wake up in the morning and you're in a safe and familiar environment, and you can just be in this low active alert state. And when we do experience some kind of form of stress, which everybody has some stressors, we can basically be in this active alert state, or if we have to, if it's a really significant stress, we'll get into an alarm state. But the point is that there's a proportional response internally to what is actually happening in the external world. So we don't overreact. We react to the degree that it's appropriate for us to cope with that problem, and then when that problem's over, we go back down to our baseline. Now, a child or an adult who's grown up with developmental chaos, threat, trauma, unpredictability, and poverty, for example, poverty in and of itself is a significant stressor. It creates a climate of unpredictability and threat that can alter the stress response systems in ways maybe not as extreme as this top curve here, but it alters the stress response systems and makes people more dysregulated. And this is what happens with these, is that you wake up in the morning, you'll be in a safe and familiar environment, and your brain basically says you're under threat. And so what happens is if your brain is telling you you're under threat all the time, it's continually sending signals of activation to parts of the brain and activation into parts of the periphery, and you wear out. You get more, you literally have physiological patterns of activation in your heart, in your pancreas, in your lungs, in your limbic system, in your cortex that impair functioning over time. And this state-dependent, this change in activation plays into something that we call state-dependent functioning. So let me just walk you through this. The thing about being in a state of arousal or threat is that when anybody feels threatened, you will have a significant change in the way your stress response system functions. And I'm trying to find that slide. I guess I don't have it here. Sorry. Try that. I have to go down this way because it's too. There we go. All right. Let me just give you a visual so that you can understand this. Here's our upside down triangle brain model. And if somebody is lucky enough to have incoming input from the outside world and incoming input from their own body that says you're regulated, right? You're not under threat. You're not thirsty. You're not hungry. You're not worried about where you're going to live tomorrow. You're not worried about anybody coming in and beating you up. You're not worried about community violence. You can use this really smart part of your brain. And you can be reflective and abstract. And when the home visitor comes and knocks on the door and they talk about how important it is to hold your baby and look in their eyes and turn the TV off and how breastfeeding is good and all that stuff that you want to try to teach them, this smart part of your brain can actually hear what's being said. But if you are a typical human being, the mere act of being interactive with anybody means that you can't, in that moment, be completely reflective. You're not thinking in your most abstract way when you are in an interaction with somebody or when you're going about the business of daily life. You're in an active, alert state. You're externally focused. You're doing routine activities. And then the home visitor knocks on the door. And you might, if you're very lucky, if that person makes you feel safe and regulated, you might go back here for a little while and you might actually absorb what they have to say, but it's just as likely that you are going to move to this state. Why are you here? Are you going to be judgmental of me? Are you going to remove my child? Are you going to report to CPS? Are you going to, all these things that run through their head, are you going to be critical of me because I didn't do the dishes? Are you going to do whatever? And until a trusting relationship can be formed, the default response of somebody coming to your home and telling you how to raise your child, even though you don't say that I'm here to tell you how to raise your child, is going to be that individuals are going to not be capable of hearing or processing as efficiently what you have to say as you think they are. And I'll come back and talk about what the implications of that are in a minute. But state-dependent functioning means that when you are in a state of low-level alarm, certain parts of your cortex are unavailable. You just aren't going to be able to be future-oriented. You just are not going to be able to reason very well. And if you're a child sitting in a classroom and the teacher's teaching, a child who's in an alarm state, now remember that graph I showed you earlier, that if you have had developmental trauma and adversity, your baseline state of arousal is going to be this low-level alarm state. And so when you go to school and somebody's trying to teach you something, and you're sitting next to somebody who's in this state, and they're in the active alert state, they're going to have easier access to their cortex, and they're going to learn more efficiently and more quickly and require fewer repetitions than somebody in this state. And many of the people that we interact with in home visiting models, home visiting interactions, you will find yourself having to have many repetitions to get the same content across. Many more repetitions than you think should be required to master the content. But this, again, is something that's related to state-dependent functioning. Now, the more threatened you are, the more primitive is, the lower and lowest parts of your brain are in control of your functioning. And it's because this lower part of the brain, the lowest part of the brain, is essentially very reactive and reflexive. It's just not going to be capable of either relating to you in any healthy way or hearing what you have to say. And so reasoning with somebody who is in this state of high arousal just does not work. It's like trying to talk to a child who's having a temper tantrum. In that moment, they're just not capable of processing that information. Whereas, 20 minutes later, when the child's feeling less tuned up and they're in your arms and you're rocking them, then they can hear things that you have to say, but you don't want to debrief or process things with somebody when they're in that state of highest arousal. Let me see where, now, I want to show you something. I want to kind of walk through this a little bit and talk a little bit more about the pattern of activation that is required to sorry, just give me 1 second here. We've got to pull up the right slides. I want to talk about a different pattern of activation of the stress response system that leads to resilience. Now, you may or may not recall that on this slide, that activation of the stress response system in predictable and moderate ways actually makes you resilient. And so this is really a powerful thing. This is really an important thing, because this is how you heal if you have become sensitized. And this is how you take a child who's just born and help them develop a healthy stress response system. And this is, in many ways, understanding this neurobiology and this neurobiology, these two different patterns of activation of the stress response, is understanding the mechanism that underlies both vulnerability that many of the individuals you work with demonstrate, and this other side of this pattern of stress activation represents what it is that you are doing in your intervention that will help them get better. So again, let me just go back to these concepts and elaborate on them a little bit. So we know, again, this presentation really isn't about neuroplasticity, but let me just say this, that one of the fundamental principles of neuroplasticity, in other words, the neuroplasticity refers to the fact that the brain is changeable, but it's changeable under certain conditions. One of the most important principles is that the brain will change, but in order for the brain to change and neural networks in the brain to change, you have to activate the neural network that you want to change. Again, this sounds sort of obvious, but think about it for a second. If a child has stress-related problems, the way that you activate, because the stress response systems are overly active and overly reactive, in other words, they're sensitized, the only way to change that is to actually activate the stress response systems. And what that means is somehow therapeutic interactions need to be tiny little doses of activating the stress response system. But the qualities of that activation are such that you have to allow an element of controllability, there has to be predictability, and there has to be moderate controlled doses. And so, again, I don't want to get too complex here, but I know that you remember a little bit about what that sensitized pattern looks like. So remember this. Remember that if you have a sensitized stress response system like this, you're vulnerable. If you have a stress response system that's neurotypical, like most of us, you're going to have this linear relationship between internal response and stress activation. But this has implications for how easily we can learn. Learning is the introduction of novelty. And novelty is something that will make the brain go, uh-oh. So whenever you learn something new, like even now as I'm trying to teach these new concepts to you, part of you, this is, for some of you, this is outside of your comfort zone. And so hopefully I'm not teaching too much too fast. If I did, you'd be up here. You'd be like, oh, I don't understand that. Did he say this? Did he say that? I don't get it. And the more I pour more content in and I use jargon, I talk about locus coeruleus and the amygdala, and you'd go, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. But if hopefully, I'm pacing this not so that it's not too overwhelming, and hopefully I'm pacing it so it's not stuff you already know completely. And this is what we refer to sort of as the Goldilocks place. It's not too big, not too little, it's just right. And so the idea of helping somebody learn or develop or have a therapeutic experience in an optimal way is that the dose, the challenge that you provide in the learning interaction is just right. It's not too much, it's not too long, it's not too overwhelming. Now the problem is, and this is something that I want you to think about as a home visitor or in a home visiting program. If you have a caregiver who has had all these developmental challenges and they're distressed and overwhelmed, here's what you need to understand, is that the tiniest little bit of novelty is going to push them outside of their ability to really internalize new content. What that means is, for the first few times you even visit, just being present in their home is going to be enough to make them incapable of really internalizing any content. This is why, when you're talking to policymakers and politicians about all this stuff, part of what I try to help them understand is that, the effective dose in a home visiting model is much higher than what you're willing to pay for. You need to sort of establish a meaningful, enduring, predictable relationship. And you can do that with 5-10-minute visits more effectively than you can do that with one 1-hour visit. And so the dosing of how you do this is really important. And the thing that you need to remember is that the dose that is tolerable for a sensitized person or a traumatized person is much smaller than the dose that is tolerable from somebody who is a neurotypical individual. So again, what this in other words, this is also what this means. The expectations that we might have for what an adult can learn in a period of time is frequently unrealistic when we're talking about working with individuals who've had developmental trauma. A child who's had lots of chaos, threat, and neglect, what is a tolerable dose for them is much smaller than a tolerable dose for a child who is not had that problem. And so when you're thinking about school, what you think about, an example of, this might be a tolerable dose, predictable dose of experience for a child who has had no trauma. When in fact, this dosing and the timing of dosing, it's spread out more and there's fewer, just a little bit less of a challenge, that's going to be a much more effective dose than this. And part of what is the important aspect of coming to understand the home you are visiting is to get some understanding of the individuals, the adults you're working with. Are they somebody who can tolerate a faster pace of introduction of content? Are they someone who needs a slower pace of introduction of content? Do they need more visits that are briefer? Can they tolerate longer visits? What do I do in the visit? How do I regulate someone in the visit? And what are regulating interactions? And again, I'm going to talk about that in just a minute, but let me back up and talk about this aspect of the process. Now, all of you who have been, everybody who's in this field, who does any work in early childhood home visitation, you've heard one way or another, you've heard all about attachment, you've heard about the power of the maternal-infant dyadic experience. You've probably heard the caregiver referred to as the external stress regulator, and that is in fact true. And so let's talk about this a little bit. One of the things that you are encouraging the young mothers or old mothers, whoever you're all working with, to do is to be present, attentive, attuned, and responsive. And the reason is, an attentive, attuned, and responsive caregiver is going to build into her child or his child, depending upon who's doing the caregiving, a pattern of activation of the stress response that leads to resilience. So let me just walk through this for 1 second, and hopefully this is sort of becoming apparent as I've talked about this. But here you are in the intrauterine period, let's say right here, and then you get born, and there's a huge sensory transition, novelty, there's hypoxia, lack of oxygen, you have this high arousal state, and then you get back down to your, you sort of fall asleep and you're comforted and warmed, and at some point you get down into your baseline. But your body starts to send feedback up to your brain that says, I don't have calories. And so, as I said before, you have autonomic regulatory capabilities, but in infants can't self-regulate around food or around hydration or around being cold. And so when they get certain signals, it literally wakes them up and they activate their own, if you will, fight or flight response. And their crying is essentially to get somebody to come and feed them or fight for them or flee with them. And so the infant's the equivalent of the escalating child, the fight or flight activation in an infant is to cry. And so if you have a caregiver who's present, responsive, and attentive, what happens is the caregiver puts the baby to her breast and rocks the baby and provides all these somatosensory cues and physiologically regulates the child, and they go back down into this state of being no longer stress activated. And this happens a million times, and you all can recognize that pattern of activation of the stress response that happens again and again and again and again and again and again and again is essentially doing this. It's providing predictable, moderate, controlled activation of the stress response system, and it's going to lead to the development of a more flexible, more capable stress response system. Now, one of the reasons that we actually have a home visiting model is that a lot of the caregivers that we are working with actually are pretty overwhelmed. You know, they might be depressed. And so their ability to be attentive and attuned and responsive gets compromised. Or they may be so overwhelmed that they are getting actually sort of angry at the child. They might get frustrated. They might actually, rather than regulating a child, dysregulate a child. And so if you've got particularly a single, isolated, overwhelmed caregiver, which is very frequently happening in our modern world, isolated, overwhelmed, economically challenged, community fragmented, their ability to provide that pattern of attentive, attuned caregiving is compromised. And as a result, what happens is these children have a stress response system that becomes increasingly sensitized. And so you can literally, and many of you who work with these kids know this, that if you've got an overwhelmed caregiver who doesn't have the benefit of a home visiting regulator, you end up with a child with a stress response capability that's actually worse than it was at the time that they were born. They become even more difficult to soothe. And so this creates this horrible cascade of a young, overwhelmed caregiver with an increasingly challenging infant, and the fit is bad, and it really leads to a high probability of risk. Now, let me talk about how important what you all do is. One of the most important things that we know about human beings, and I've, again, you all know this, but let me just talk about this in a way that might help think about it a little differently. One of the things that happens with human beings is that we are what I refer to sort of as contagious. We're neurobiologically put together to actually influence the physiological state of other people. We are influenced by others, and we in turn influence them. So if you are in the presence of someone who is upset, even if you're a pretty well-regulated person, it's only a matter of time before you start to feel dysregulated and upset yourself. And if you are a supervisor and you are calm in the midst of all kinds of craziness at work, you will help the people who work with you be better regulated and calmer. But if you are an angry, irritable, hostile supervisor, you will literally dysregulate the people around you. It's just the contagion of human beings. We are contagious. And so if you have a caregiver, a parent who's very calm and very regulated, and they have a child who's dysregulated, they are able to actually use literally their presence, the relational interaction changes the state of the child. This is what people talk about, this co-regulation, right? When the baby cries, a calm parent comes over, can rock the child and regulate them. In turn, that actually helps both the parent and the child get regulated. But what happens if you have this? If you've got a parent who is not starting from this calm point, but is actually in this active alert state, and maybe even higher for some of the people we work with, and then they have a dysregulated child, what happens is, rather than having this positive contagious interaction, you have a negative contagious interaction. The parent wants to, instead of quietly holding, they grab the child and they plead and they jiggle and they shake and they yell, and pretty soon you've got co-dysregulation. And you've got this bad situation. And now, two things I want to sort of convey. One is that human beings are contagious. I've said it before, but I want you to think about what happens if you think about these graphs in a very different way. Let's say you think about the fact that this isn't, think about what we call parallel process. What this means is, and I'm going to just draw this out, is that if you've got parent here and you've got child here, you're going to end up with a bad outcome. Let's say that you've got home visitor here. One of the most powerful and important things that the home visitor can do is basically provide a co-regulating interaction with a dysregulated parent. You, by your tone of voice, by doing reflective listening, by being non-judgmental, by being supportive and helping them do chores around the house, you can actually calm the parent down and make them come to your state of regulation. This is something that's extremely important about self-care of the home visitor. Very important about focusing on the affective relational milieu in the home as opposed to the content that you're trying to shove in the kids into the brains of these folks. And again, in no way do I want to be critical of the program elements of home visitation models, but I can guarantee you that the content is not as important as the process. And the process has to involve creating a respectful relationship with that family, being a regulating presence in their home when you are there, helping those folks be regulated will allow you to form a meaningful, true relationship so that when you do make a suggestion about content, it will actually get into the brains of the people that you're dealing with. This is one of the most important things about understanding state dependence, is that we have all kinds of well-intended programs. We have all kinds of, really powerful and important ways that we try to change and influence the behaviors of the people we're around. But they tend to be incredibly ineffective because we don't understand biology. So let me talk about this in a slightly different way. Just reinforce what I said, but give you a slightly different tool to think about. Now, what I've done here is I've basically got this is a graph that is showing the shift in cognitive capability and predominant defensive strategy when people move along the arousal continuum. And so let me just remind everybody, and I know you all know this, but let me remind you that there's more than one way to respond to threat. The classic way is this fight or flight response that everybody talks about, that we talk about it, that if you move along, and that's indicated by this hyperarousal continuum thing here. What happens is, as you start to feel threatened, you become vigilant. And so a lot of the people that we work with, that we go see, they're hypervigilant. They're scanning the environment for potential threat. If they're actually confronted with something, they become resistant. And if the threat or the interaction persists, they become defiant, and then they can ultimately become aggressive. And this is a pattern. Let's say, and this is sort of not exactly a home visiting example, but let's say that you go and there's a home that you visit, and there's a mother, and then there's let's say it's a paramour, a boyfriend, who actually doesn't want anybody in that home because he doesn't want people coming in and telling him how to do things, and he's trying to defend the mom, and so he's going to be hyper vigilant, looking for anything to be critical of you about, anything. And so you might make a gentle suggestion about something and he'll be resistant. And you might try to explain it very simply. You might just say, well, this is kind of what we mean. And then he'll get openly defiant because he's just going to keep getting escalated because you're not going away. And then they can actually be threatening. And we've worked with people who do home visiting, and there have been situations and scenarios where members of the household actually try to intimidate away or openly threaten the home visitor. Now, fortunately, that's, we hope that's minimized in part because of all the training that home visitors get, but that happens. And it reflects somebody who's, remember, this will be an individual who came from a background where he was sensitized for some reason. And so he'll have an overreaction to the tiniest little bit of perceived disagreement or threat, and he views you as threatening in the household. Now, at the same time, you may have been working with this mother who initially is trying to deal with you by avoiding conflict, avoiding even interactions, and then when she can't avoid it because you're there, she will be what to you appears to be compliant. But the fact is it's sort of an empty compliance. If you remember that it's a compliance that's an emotional compliance, but it's not a cognitive compliance because that part of the brain is kind of shut down. And so they will give you all the nonverbal signals and maybe even verbal signals that they understand, and they'll follow through. And then later on, you'll come back and you go, they didn't act on any of the stuff that you suggested, even though they were going to be compliant. And again, this is something, if you don't understand state-dependent functioning, you frequently end up feeling frustrated and angry because they said they would do this and they didn't. And I think that they're just jerking me around. But this is an honest but state-dependent response, which means that in that moment, they are emotionally really trying to please you, but they are also, in that moment, cognitively incapable of really processing and storing what it is you're saying. And so this is where a lot of misunderstanding happens, particularly in the beginning of a visiting relationship. There'll be this sort of empty compliance, but no follow-through. And then experienced home visitors know that you just keep at it, keep at it, keep at it. Once you form a relationship, they'll actually start to hear you and process. And if they feel safe, they can ultimately start to act on what you say. But the point is that functioning of the brain is state dependent, and that the behaviors that are going to be exhibited, and this dissociative response is one where you might just talk and talk and talk, and they'll just sort of look at you and they won't blink much, and you think you got a point across, and then, you come back the next week or the next time you visit and you realize they act like they didn't even hear what I said. And when I bring it up again, they act like I never said that, but I know I said that. And state-dependent functioning and the changes in processing that go with state-dependent functioning are extremely important for people who do interpersonal work to appreciate. Now, the goal is, of course, is that over the course of you working with them, you will be able to influence, you'll be able to develop a relationship of trust and respect so that they'll be able to be regulated by your presence as opposed to having to use one of these adaptive regulatory interactions. And so let me go back and talk for a minute about a couple of strategies. One of the key strategies that I think is really important is to recognize that you have some, if you will, physiological allies in this process of figuring out how to help somebody regulate. And again, remember, the fundamental goal is to have somebody regulated, have an opportunity to build a real respectful relationship, and then you've got this wide open interstate freeway up into the cortex to change and help them grow and learn. But if you don't help them regulate, you can't get to the cortex. So let's talk about, again, how do we regulate? I mentioned this, but I don't want to, I know that I'm probably pushing you out of your optimal developmental learning zone here because I've given you so much content. But let me just remind you that I said that any system in the brain that you want to influence or change, you actually have to activate. Which means that if you want to regulate, you want to get to those systems that start low in the brain and get them to change their activity, you need to activate them. And so you can do this in a couple of ways. One, you can go from the top down. You can say to somebody who's dysregulated, calm down. And, you know, that might work, but it's rarely does that work. Top-down mechanisms tend to be, they're state-dependent, and it's a slower process. And so you really can't count on that when you're doing initial home visiting, when you're first getting to know somebody. What is happening is a lot of times you'll come into a home and they will invite you to just sit, and they will just sit. And the problem is you're also robbing them of the ability to use this kind of self-regulating. And they will be doing this. They'll be dissociating. So they'll just basically be tuning you out. They'll be kind of robotically going through the motions. And fundamentally, nothing positive is happening. And so what I want you to appreciate is this, that one of the most powerful things you can do to help somebody regulate is to go for a walk with them, is to peel potatoes with them, is to play cards with them, is to put music on, is to do something that's patterned, repetitive, and rhythmic. And I don't have the time to really talk about why that's true, but very, very briefly, what happens is in utero, your brain makes connections between patterned, repetitive, rhythmic activity and somatosensory activity and being regulated. So later on in life, when you wiggle your leg, or you go for a walk, or you hum to yourself, or you walk, or you listen to music, or you go running or ride a bike or anything like that, that is regulating. And as you get older and you make associations between human beings, you know, if you grew up in an environment where people were safe and positive, what happens is relational regulation becomes very, very powerful. So when you get upset and you interact with somebody who's kind and attentive and attuned and listens well, you can get regulated. The problem is, and this is something that this is somewhat of a more advanced talk, and I'll send everybody a chapter about this if you want, but relational regulation with people who've had a history of trauma is a double-edged sword. And again, very simply, for you and I, people who haven't had developmental trauma, intimate human interactions tend to be viewed as positive, rewarding, and regulating. But if human interactions for you were permeated by threat, episodic depression, abandonment, intimacy and relational interactions actually are dysregulated. And so many of the people that you're going to be working with respond to relational interactions in a way that if you get too close to them, you drive them away, or they are forced to push you away. And if they feel like you're abandoning them, they get equally enraged and angry. And so one of the biggest challenges of a home visitor is to be able to be still emotionally, is to be present, to be attentive, to be attuned and responsive, the exact traits that are necessary for optimal attachment building in early childhood. it's important that you're there. That's the key. That's a key. It's important you're attentive to see where you're crossing an intimacy barrier and you should back up. It's important to be attentive to whether they're being compliant in a full way or whether they're just basically nodding because they want to get through the time you're there and want you to leave. If you're attentive and attuned, what you learn to do is just be present and patient and do something that's regulatory, like suggest, let's go for a walk. And if you do that with sufficient repetition, you'll ultimately build a trusting relationship that can then be the vehicle for effective work. But remember that it's not going to be the same. Not everybody's going to be the same. I mean, some people will warm up to you quickly. Some people will warm up slowly. Some people will take lots of visits, and then a certain kind of, something that you feel like you're at a certain point in your relationship, you might cross a boundary and blow up the whole interaction. And so this is the whole issue about being present, attentive, attuned, and then appropriately responsive is extremely important for being successful in home visiting relationships. Now, one of the things that, let me go to this. Sometimes you don't have the option of just going for a walk or doing other kinds of somatosensory regulatory things. And I just want to assure you that you can do regulatory things in context of the way you communicate with somebody. Now, this is sort of written for collaborative problem solving in context of interacting with a child. But what I want you to do is sort of just get an understanding that when you're with somebody and you're respectful and you use reassurance and reflective listening, what happens is people feel safer, they feel regulated. And what will happen is when they feel regulated, they are much more likely to then engage you in a meaningful way. And so for those of you who don't know about collaborative problem solving, I would suggest that you learn a little bit more about it. It's a very powerful, very practical way to think about the moment-by-moment interaction with you and another person that is going to help you develop the rhythm in conversation and the respectful stance in the interaction that can provide that regulating presence to allow this sequence of engagements to take place. Now, many of you probably use these capabilities, probably use reflective listening and a whole variety of other respectful and, if you will, attuned processes already. But I think that one of the things that we all can get better at is understanding how, number one, how powerful we are in shaping the affect of others, in creating the actual relational milieu with our affect. And again, part of what that means is you have to go into the home visiting interaction regulated. If you're not regulated, you're not going to be able to do your work. And so for those of you who are supervisors, for those of you who are frontline workers, for those of you who are involved in this in a policy or practice way, really what this means is we have to do a much better job at creating self-care plans and addressing secondary trauma with individuals who do this work, because the instrument of change is the relationship. The effectiveness of the relationship depends upon the regulatory capabilities of the visitor. And if the home visitor isn't respected, isn't rested, isn't given the self-care that she or he requires, they're going to be a blunt instrument. and they are not going to be effective. It's hard enough to do this work if you are regulated. It's very hard if you are really well regulated to go into a dysregulated environment that's chaotic and help bring over time structure and chaos, structure from the chaos and create regulation. But it's impossible if you yourself are not regulated. So I don't even know what time it is. I think I must be close to almost the end of the time I'm going to talk. Let me just end by saying this. I have great respect for the work that you all do. We know that it's effective. We also know that efficacy is going to be tied to the factors that I talked about. How well you take care of yourself, how well you are respectful of the people you interact with, how you create a regulated environment that allows the creation of meaningful relationships, which ultimately will then be the vehicle for conveying of content, cognitive content. And we know that that sequence of engagement is essential for that. So now, the degree to which that is related to the health of the child and the cognitive capability of the child, let me take one sentence about that because that's what the title of the talk was. But I think you all could see that if you are a child who grows up with a dysregulated stress response system, and you think about what I said about state-dependent functioning and the distribution of the neural networks involved in physiological regulation of the body and upstream impact on brain-mediated functions, you can see that really a child who is dysregulated is going to have a tremendously difficult time concentrating in school and learning effectively, and they're going to have a set of physiological systems in the periphery that are continually bombarded by overactive and overly reactive autonomic neuroendocrine and neuroimmune patterns of activation, which will lead to risk for physical health problems. So the very same physiology, in understanding of the very same physiology that puts these children at risk, also explains and gives some guidance to how you can interact with the families you work with in ways that can be tolerance-inducing, that can be resilience-building, as opposed and provide the opposing pattern of activation to the sensitizing pattern that put these families at risk in the first place. So I think I am going to, for any of you who want more information, I've got this content up here, and I think I will stop sharing my desktop and turn it over to everybody else and see if we have a few questions in the last few minutes.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Perry. That was a lot of great food for thought, and I think emphasizes much of the conversation that has been taking place among the home visiting program community about, first, I think your comments related to what I might describe as kind of starting with self a bit. The fact that, you know, how we do our job is based on how well we're prepared to do that job. And so our own responses to regulation and patterns in order to then develop what you described as kind of optimal attachment. I'm going to invite folks to, at this point in time, as you see here on your screen, some instructions about how to submit questions that you might have using the Q&A feature. So please do so at this point. If we have too many questions, then we can respond to at this point in time before we close the webinar forum today. We very much appreciate the fact that Dr. Perry is more than happy to respond to those questions outside of this forum. And so please make sure that you do include your questions, and we will archive them and make sure that you do receive a response. But very quickly, while we're seeing if there's any questions in the queue, Dr. Perry, I'm wondering if you can just quickly you mentioned secondary trauma.
Yeah.
Can you just briefly talk about the implications of that?
Well, yeah, we do in our work, and I think all of you who are listening know that a lot of the both the families and circumstances that we interact with lead to lots of exposure to vicarious trauma. And one of the things that happens is you can actually end up having your own stress response systems activated in these unpredictable and prolonged ways, even if you yourself were not the direct target of the trauma. So, and at the same time, many of us who do frontline work end up in situations where we feel unsettled and unstable and sometimes even threatened by the work. So the one thing that, and I didn't talk about this because I just didn't have time, but one of the things that we know is that the number one factor related to your healthy development and capacity to tolerate unpredictability and adversity is relational health. And that means connection to family, community, culture. And so what we've seen is that our general working population is much more vulnerable to secondary trauma because in the last 20 years, we've become much more relationally fragmented as a culture. We spend many, many, many more hours in front of a screen. We spend less and less time in conversation. We have less touch. We have less, any system we're in, we're tending to stretch the teachers, the frontline workers, everybody to the point where, there aren't even opportunities to interact with your colleagues as much. So the one thing that we know is that the more there are for like team-based interventions, the more there are opportunities within an organization to have respite, to have training activities that are stepping back from the frontline work, the more there's some predictability and controllability of when you do the hard work and when you don't, the more individuals are able to resist sort of the effects of burnout and secondary trauma. But the bottom line is that we're so contagious, human beings are so contagious that if you spend time working with individuals who are in a state of high arousal all the time, it is absolutely inevitable that that's going to change your state of arousal. And so you need to have adequate hours in the presence of regulated people in order to get your baseline state of arousal back to a state where it can be both healthy, but then ultimately an effective tool when you interact with the dysregulated folks.
Sounds like a reset button almost.
It is kind of.
Yeah.
And a lot of the people in our field are such rescuers that they feel guilty if they take time off. They feel guilty if they do the things that actually help them stay healthy. And so this is a big area. We have to really work on our folks and tell them that it's not a weakness to take a vacation. You know, it's amazing. People don't take their vacation days. Anyway.
Yeah. So I wanted to get to a couple of questions here. Heather Palmer, who's joined us, has a question here. If a family you are visiting is in a regulated state, is there a recommended number of goals or materials you would suggest trying to teach or go over?
You know, one of the things I think is so important in any high-quality program is to be responsive to the actual individuals and families you're working with. So part of the challenge of, and again, this question sort of speaks to it, is that some families will need help and direction in one area because and not in another. And so to some degree, you have to sort of pick and choose based upon the strengths and vulnerabilities that you see within the family. But there are a few fundamental things that I think are really helpful. We teach all of our families that we work with about the difference between age and development. And we teach them all about state-dependent functioning. And so now we use somewhat different tools to do that, but time and time again, we have adults who grow up and have very unrealistic understanding of what is a reasonable expectation of a child and what is unreasonable. And if you've got a 4-year-old child and a parent thinks that they can do things that a 5-year-old should be able to do, but because of their developmental history, they can only function like a 2-year-old, there's a big gap between what the parent thinks they can do and what the child is capable of doing. And so within that gap will be created disappointment, frustration, anger. People frequently, particularly as kids get older, interpret that the child's inability to do what they're told or do what the expectation is willful, and it just leads to lots of mess. So we spend a lot of time talking about how people function under threat or stress, and then we talk a lot about having realistic expectations of what a child can do.
Great, thank you. So another question we just received is, so a home visitor who is a trauma survivor and not regulated herself, going into these chaotic home situations and getting triggered, is it a good idea to back off from participating in this program?
Well, if they're getting triggered, it's a good idea that they actually try to get some help. But I have to say that some of the most powerful and helpful folks in those settings are individuals who themselves understand and have had developmental trauma. See, developmental trauma is not there's a certain form of post-traumatic wisdom, post-traumatic strength that many people carry around that makes them very good at some of this work. But if they themselves are finding that it's overwhelming, they really should think about dosing. Is this too big a dose for me right now until I sort of figure this out? And so what you'll find is that they work really well with one family and not another, because there might be a specific evocative cue in one setting and not another. So I think that that's an issue for, again, is somewhat of an individualized supervision, but the goal is to recognize, I think, that they have tremendous strengths based upon that, history of adversity. It's just that you don't want them to be put in a position where they're asked to do things that are going to undermine their strengths. And so.
Great. Well, we do have a couple of other questions that came in related to tips for self-care, et cetera, that we can absolutely follow up with folks around, as well as the other questions that have come in with Dr. Perry. We are a little bit over our time, so I want to be very respectful of your time this morning. And so I wanted to, first of all, thank Dr. Perry once again for your expertise and for your willingness to share some time with us this morning with our group here of home visitors. And also, just as a reminder that after you log off the webinar form this morning, you will be receiving a survey evaluation form that will pop up in the window. Please take a moment to complete that evaluation, as we very much welcome your feedback in order to continue improving any future forms that will be put together. At this point in time, Gina, I just wanted to make sure that just invite you to have any closing comments.
I just wanted to thank everybody for being here and participating, and thank Dr. Perry again for presenting this really fantastic webinar. Thank you.
My pleasure. And everybody out there, go keep changing the world. You're doing good work.
And if anybody would like to reach either Gina or I, you can see the contact information here. Please feel free to do so. And again, the recording and any additional resources that we will be getting from Dr. Perry will be forwarded to you via a link to a website. Thank you all so very much, and have a wonderful rest of the day.